Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of our discussions for disease and injury prevention. I'm Brenda Greene, and this week we're going to be touching on obesity. This is something that we all know has become a major public health problem in the past number of years, but not necessarily something um, that has the advocacy or the background as some of the other diseases that we're going to touch on in this course. So I just want to preface the presentation by saying that I've recorded each slide individually. It certainly works better for me, and I'm hoping it will work better for you as well. So in the bottom right-hand corner of each slide, you'll see a little audio symbol. You'll be able to click on this symbol, get my audio for that individual slide, and I'm hoping it'll just better be able to set your own pace through the slideshow and then go back if you need to reread something, if you have questions, or if you want to comment on something. So on that, so we'll start with an overview of what my presentation will cover. We will go through an introduction on obesity, providing a little bit of background and a little bit of the debate over whether obesity is an individual or a social problem. We will cover the epidemiology of the disease, as well as the burden of the disease for several countries included in the literature. We will do a literature review. We'll focus on the causes, and I question this word. Perhaps we should say theories, because like many of the other diseases that we'll look at, obesity isn't really caused by any one individual factor, and everyone is kind of on their own theory about what does cause it. We'll also look at inequality and obesity, as well as job strain and obesity. We will look briefly at my interpretation of screening for obesity, and then we will go into prevention interventions, looking at individual approaches, social approaches, and policy approaches. And then we'll finish up with a brief conclusion and our discussion questions for this week. So just before we head into our introduction, I just want to touch on our objectives for this presentation. First, I want to discuss the obesity rates and trends and give you a better idea of how obesity is progressing and moving through our society. We'll also discuss the social and environmental factors that are contributing to rising obesity rates, and then discuss the prevention strategies and future policy implications for this problem. As we know, it is a major problem, and it is something that we are going to need to effectively address and tackle moving forward in order to keep our populations healthy. So what is obesity? Obesity is most commonly quantified using the measurement known as body mass index, or BMI. This measurement is easily calculated using your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. Obesity is defined as having a body mass index greater than or equal to 30. And rates of obesity are rapidly increasing. Obesity started to become a problem in the 1980s, and rates have been rising ever since. In 1997, obesity was actually recognized by the World Health Organization as a major public health problem. And this isn't surprising, considering obesity is a risk factor for hypertension, type 2 diabetes, gallbladder disease, some cancers, and can also significantly impact on an individual's quality of life, especially when we look at self-esteem and body image, given the negative stigma often associated with obesity. Obesity has been traditionally seen as an individual problem, and even obese individuals themselves tend to take most of the blame. They acknowledge that they should eat less and exercise more, and this further contributes to the concept of personal responsibility and victim blaming when it comes to obesity. Fortunately, we are moving towards an understanding of obesity as a social problem, and this is in part due to us recognizing that we live in an obesogenic environment. An obesogenic environment can be thought of as the sum of influences that the surroundings, opportunities, or conditions of life have on promoting obesity in individuals and populations. And this environment is perceived to predispose, enable, and reinforce ways of living that promote high calorie foods and discourage physical activity. Over centuries, our bodies haven't changed. We've essentially stayed exactly the same. However, our environment has changed tremendously so that we now have to make a conscious effort to eat well. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on our obesogenic environment. As I said, we have a radically changing environment, but an unchanging body. And this is creating some challenges, mainly because our bodies are biologically predisposed to store fat in times of abundance in order to prepare for lean times. However, those lean times generally don't come anymore. Furthermore, we have no longer living on farms or have to work day and night to secure our access to foods. Instead, we have unprecedented access to widely available, cheap, energy dense, highly palatable foods that we can obtain without ever even getting out of our vehicles. Even vehicles themselves are a factor of the obesogenic environment. We no longer walk where we need to go, we drive. This is in part due to urban design and planned transportation routes, especially when we consider the extent of urban sprawl in many cities. We can't realistically expect people to walk or bike to work when they live 70 kilometers away from their job along a major transportation route. Even our workplaces and lifestyles have evolved to decrease physical activity levels. Work practices have been modified extensively so that heavy manual labor is almost non existent, and technology has contributed to us being increasingly sedentary at home as well. We can now work and play with virtually no physical activity required. So, now we'll touch on the epidemiology of obesity. As we've said, obesity has been recognized as a major public health problem and is often referred to as a global epidemic. And this is mainly because obesity does affect both developed and developing countries. And unfortunately, Canada is no exception. Between 2011 and 2012, 6.3 million Canadian adults were classified as obese, and this represented an increase of 17.5% since 2003. Some of the highest levels of obesity were observed in Atlantic Canada, and this is especially bad for us as 35.2% of Newfoundland and Labradorians were obese at that time. More men are obese than women, and rates seem to be increasing faster among men. So, the historical trends of obesity have seemingly reversed themselves. In the past, access to food was a sign of wealth and status, and so only the richest populations could really afford to be fat. In recent years, however, this trend has reversed itself so that now obesity is higher among our poorer populations. And this is undoubtedly a side effect of the availability of cheap, energy dense foods seemingly everywhere we look. Obesity rates are also higher in market liberal economies, and that is economies where markets are quite flexible with lower trade barriers, reduced tax rates, and limited government spending. These economies include those of Canada and the United States, and they tend to create an environment of greater economic insecurity. Many researchers hypothesize that this level of insecurity creates stress that subsequently contributes to higher rates of obesity among the population. Market liberal economies are also associated with greater income inequality, which is also associated with higher rates of obesity. And we will touch on these couple of factors. So we're going to look now at the burden of disease for obesity. In Canada, it is estimated that obesity costs our economy $4.6 billion in 2008, and that represented a significant increase from the $3.9 billion that it cost in 2000. This economic burden estimate is based on both direct costs to the healthcare system, which would include hospital care, medication, and physician care, as well as indirect costs to productivity, such as loss of economic contribution and disability, that are often associated with obesity. In the United Kingdom, they've estimated that obesity costs their economy 4.2 billion British pounds in 2007, so even more than the Canadian estimate. They've also speculated that costs associated with obesity to society could rise to 50 billion British pounds by the year 2050. Not surprisingly, the economic burden of disease for obesity is completely unsustainable, and so prevention becomes vital. Obesity has been associated with significant morbidity, and it has been linked to both physical diseases such as hypertension and type 2 diabetes, as well as mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. Childhood obesity has also been associated with a higher risk of developing chronic diseases later in life. Given that childhood obesity rates in Canada have nearly tripled in the past 30 years, this further emphasizes the need for prevention. Not surprisingly, obesity is also associated with premature mortality, with obese individuals having a significantly higher risk of. So next we're going to go into our literature review, and first we're going to look at causation. And as I said before, I would consider these theories about the causes of obesity as opposed to actual causes, simply because we're not really sure. But either way, these theories can either be focused on the individual patient or on society as a whole. So the biomedical perspective focuses on the individual patient and views obesity as being caused by deficient behavior or biology. We either don't eat properly and don't exercise enough, or we're genetically predisposed to obesity or behaviors that influence obesity. This theory also considers the association between obesity and mental health, recognizing that illnesses such as depression and anxiety are predictive of weight control problems. In contrast, the obesogenic environment perspective focuses on the social and environmental factors that influence obesity. This theory acknowledges that the individual is a product of their environment. As such, obesity is seen not as a result of individual lack of control, but as a result of many complex social and environmental factors, including cheap, energy-dense foods and associated relentless marketing campaigns, poor urban design and transportation strategies, as well as a lack of appropriate resources and strategies in our current healthcare systems to effectively manage rising obesity. So next we're going to look at the literature related to inequality and obesity. So income inequality has been associated with obesity rates in 21 developed countries. Income inequality is associated with a wide range of social factors and health consequences. Many of these are highlighted in the book The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, which many of us have read in a previous course, and if you haven't, it is an excellent read. Obesity and inequality specifically are further studied in this week's reading by the same authors as well as others. Highlighting the striking difference in obesity rates between equal and unequal countries is the comparison between Japan and the United States. Based on a comparison of the richest 20% of the population to the poorest 20%, Japan has the highest level of income equality in developed countries, while the United States has the lowest. Not surprisingly, Japan's low level of inequality is associated with the lowest rates of obesity, while the United States' high level of inequality is associated with the highest rates of obesity. It is important to note here that obesity rates were independent of average income and absolute living standard. And so it's more about it's less about how much money you make and more about how much money you make compared to your neighbors, which is indicative that the social comparison theory is at play here. Psychosocial effects of your social position may contribute to behavioral or physiological processes contributing to obesity. And this phenomenon raises the issues with the merit of individual approaches to obesity treatment and prevention. Individuals need to be in control of their social position in order to be able to make decisions to counteract obesity. And if you're in a position where your social position puts you at a disadvantage, those types of individual approaches may not be feasible or realistic. Next, we're going to look at the literature surrounding job strain, and I've also included insecurity on this slide as well. Job strain may contribute to obesity rates. Stress can contribute to weight gain via psychological effects on behavior and metabolism. This is most apparent when job strain comes from high psychological workload and a lack of social supports to effectively handle that workload. Job strain can essentially turn into chronic stress, which may alter adrenocortical activity. This can lead to insulin resistance as well as abdominal obesity. Studies have shown that employees experiencing chronic stress are 50% more likely to be obese. Economic insecurity is also a strong predictor of obesity prevalence, and a prime example of this exists in the United States. They have a very high level of economic insecurity and also have a very high level of obesity. One important thing to note here is that the association between economic insecurity and obesity is only true for market liberal countries. So again, those are the countries with higher freedom on their trades and again, higher inequalities and economic. I wanted to touch on screening just briefly because it is such an important component of disease and injury prevention. However, screening for obesity is far less complex compared to other chronic diseases. Screening for obesity doesn't require blood tests or invasive procedures. In fact, it doesn't even require a physician. We can very easily determine our BMI on our own. In fact, Google will provide a body mass index calculator very easily after a quick search. As we mentioned before, general obesity is defined as having a body mass index greater than or equal to 30. We also see central obesity using waist circumference as a measure of obesity, greater than 102 centimeters for men and greater than 88 centimeters for women. There are some limitations to the use of body mass index. For example, pregnant women and bodybuilders would not be accurately classified based on their BMI. However, it is a good estimate and it is widely applied in scientific research. Similarly, waist circumference is a good measure of central or abdominal obesity and is often used because the abdominal area is considered to be the worst place to carry excess fat. Calculation of the waist to hip ratio can also be used as a means of determining health risk based on body size. So next we're going to look at prevention. Traditionally, prevention of obesity has been based on an individual approach, and this is still commonly employed today. Um, an individual approach focuses on behavior modification mostly, and our main focus is on ensuring that individuals consume a healthy diet and participate in regular physical activity. Um, some components of this individual approach are accountability, either to a physician, a dietitian, or a family member, just someone who regularly checks in and keeps an eye on progress. And one of the things that research has shown is that sustained support is absolutely key for an individual approach to obesity control to work. Um, Individuals need to have access to support services such as dietitians and personal trainers and those types of professionals who can support them on their journey to getting their obesity under control. Unfortunately, this traditional individual approach is not overly effective, and some of the factors that limit the effectiveness of an individual approach include lack of motivation, medical limitations, social circumstances, and material resources. So, to look at each of those individually, lack of motivation is pretty self explanatory, especially when we consider everything else that individuals have on the go. Most people have a job, they have a family, they have other commitments, and oftentimes healthy eating and physical activity kind of get pushed to the bottom of the totem pole and are not given priority that really they should be. Medical limitations are especially poignant for obese individuals, especially when you consider mobility issues, breathing issues, those kinds of things that can make it very difficult for an obese individual to increase their physical activity levels. Social circumstances include factors such as neighborhood safety and the availability and affordability of fresh fruits and vegetables. Obviously, these factors will have a significant influence on one's ability to change their behavior. If you live in a poor neighborhood where you're afraid to go outside after dark, then that's going to mean that you can't go for a walk when you get home from work. And so that's going to significantly limit the effectiveness of this type of approach. And finally, material resources such as financial resources to pay for a gym membership or a personal trainer, or even the availability of transportation to and from support groups, whether that be your physician, your dietitian, or even a group such as Weight Watchers. Not having these material resources, again, would significantly limit the effectiveness of this type of individual. So, continuing with our discussion of individual approaches to preventing obesity, I also wanted to touch on surgery. This wasn't something that was mentioned in the readings this week, but it's something that I have personal experience with, and I think it definitely should be part of the conversation, both for treatment and prevention of obesity related consequences. So, bariatric surgical procedures induce weight loss by limiting the amount of food the stomach can hold. There are a number of different types, but most surgeries are minimally invasive and are associated with relatively short hospital stays. Um, Sustained weight loss is the goal of the surgery and is quite high in most cases. Also, the surgery induces physiological changes that suppress hunger, reduce appetite, and improve satiety. Um, it is done as a treatment for a lot of obese individuals, but I think it's also important to note that the weight loss experienced by these surgery patients can also mitigate future health problems. The reason I say I have personal experience with bariatric surgery is because both my sister and her husband have undergone surgery where they've actually removed 80% of their stomachs. So they can no longer eat the big meals or the fatty foods that they used to enjoy, which obviously was why they were obese in the first place. But for my brother in law, especially, he had a lot of health complications before he went into the surgery. He had a heart attack at only 35 years of age. But since the surgery, he's lost over 100 pounds. He's kept it off, and he has actually gotten off most of his medication. So all of his medication for heart disease, he no longer has to take it. He's no longer diabetic. He has gotten rid of all of that, all of those medications that he had become so dependent on. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that surgery is not only a treatment, but it can also prevent future health problems. So for him, he no longer has to worry about cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The weight loss was enough to take care of them. So next we're going to look at prevention of obesity from a social perspective, or as Deborah Cohen describes in her TED Talk, prevention from a public health approach. Bringing awareness to obesity and educating individuals on how to eat healthy and exercise is simply not enough to tackle the current obesity epidemic. Instead, we need to focus on a public health approach where we create conditions in which people can be healthy, and also where we reduce the risks and remove the burden of control from the individual. In her TED Talk, Deborah talks about the provision of safe drinking water as one of the greatest public health accomplishments of all time. And she also puts a little spin on it to get you really thinking about prevention. She says, what would happen if we put the burden of providing safe drinking water on each individual household? So instead of public health services and municipalities putting in a water treatment system and putting in a distribution system and piping safe drinking water into individual homes, what if we put that burden on the individual homeowner themselves? We need to recognize that such a situation would simply set people up for failure, and that seems to be exactly what we're doing with food. So in her TED Talk, she also provides an interesting scenario on what would happen if we treated alcohol the same way that we treat food. She says, what if, for pennies more, we supersized alcohol? What if there were all-you-could-drink buffets for a fixed price? What about if alcohol was in vending machines in every office building on every floor? What if there was alcohol at the checkout line in hardware stores? You can see where I'm going with this. And people would essentially be drunk all the time. There would be more violence and more motor vehicle incidents. There would be increased mortality from liver cirrhosis and an increase in alcohol-related chronic diseases. Now, it might seem a little far-fetched or silly to compare food to alcohol, but according to Deborah, she makes a good point for why it isn't unfair to compare the two. Because when you think about everything that sounds ridiculous to do to alcohol, it's exactly what we're doing to food. And so we need to control food as we control alcohol. Some examples include having standard portions in restaurants. So instead of getting a plate that's 3,000 calories, we get a plate that's 750 calories so that we no longer have to take responsibility of limiting how much we eat. Similarly, we need to restrict impulse marketing. So in supermarkets, the ends of the aisles need to not be stocked with junk food where our eye is automatically drawn and we're more likely to buy the junk food that again is going to contribute to obesity rates. And she also suggests control of sale to youth. So we need to make sure that our youth are exposed to healthier foods and that the vending machines in schools aren't full of junk food. We need to take away that temptation and we need to reduce the burden of control that we're putting on individuals to control their own obesity. We need to recognize it as a social problem and again put in social controls so that it's not all. Next, we're going to talk about prevention from a policy perspective. Policy approaches to preventing obesity have the greatest potential to promote and sustain widespread population behavior change. However, creating multidisciplinary policies and getting everyone on board will likely prove to be very difficult. Some examples of proposed policy changes include public policies targeted at urban environments, more specifically, policies that increase the level of planning into urban design, as well as policies that address transformation of current environments. Some examples would include the installation of bike lanes, more pedestrian friendly walkways, those kinds of things that make it much easier for individuals to get outside and to be active and healthy. Similarly, workplace policies in support of healthy lifestyle behaviors are becoming more influential and recommended. Again, many people are very sedentary in their jobs and at their workplace, and the will and the support of upper management and CEOs, those kinds of higher level influences, can certainly increase healthy living behaviors of individuals at work. And policy targeted at the food industry specifically is going to be a big one going forward. As we discussed on the last page, we need to think about controlling food as we control alcohol. Limitations on advertising and sales, especially to youth, is going to be a big one, just so that we don't go forward with food basically being shoved down your throat everywhere you turn. It's become a social environment where everything we do, we're surrounded by food and we're drawn to food. One of the biggest downfalls with policy approaches is that governments are very unwilling to implement policies that they view as paternalistic or trying to force views or opinions or choices on individuals. And this is a bit of a catch-22, and it goes back to the reality that obesity is still viewed as an individual problem and a personal responsibility. And it will be very difficult to implement policy changes as long as we view obesity as an individual problem. It's one of those things where you won't get political will to change if we keep viewing it as an individual problem, but the problem won't go away until we implement the policies needed to. So in conclusion, I just want to briefly recap the major points that we've covered in this presentation. Obesity has become a major public health problem. I don't think anyone will argue with this statement. It is certainly a risk factor for many chronic diseases, both physical diseases and mental illnesses, and it does place a significant burden on healthcare systems, both in the developing and developed world. Where traditionally we thought of obesity as an individual problem, we are moving away from that mindset and towards the mindset that obesity certainly has social and environmental factors that contribute to its prevalence. We touched on the obesogenic environment and essentially how our current environment is setting people up for failure. Food advertising and food marketing is everywhere that we look. Our bodies have stayed the same, but our environment has rapidly changed. We no longer have to work night and day to secure access to food. We simply have to hop in our cars, go through a drive-through, and we have an overabundance of energy-dense food right at our fingertip. So prevention no longer is sufficient on an individual scale. Effective prevention will require multiple levels of support and policy. So as we discussed, that will mean not only individual education, but social policies, a public health approach, and governmental policies that may seem paternalistic, but are absolutely necessary in order to modify our environment and to take control of the food that is contributing to our current unsustainable rates of obesity. I've provided 3 questions for discussion this week. Please feel free to answer any 2 of these questions. I look forward to discussing them with you, and I look forward to hopefully answering all of the questions that you guys may have about the presentation this week. Thank you.